arrival in New Zealand, we were greeted by a number of familiar species, the first of which, the silvereye, we had observed extensively in Japan and was of no particular concern to the New Zealand government, as they appeared to have travelled there naturally. However, the Eurasian blackbird is very much an introduced species, although, as it does not appear to significantly threaten native species, it is again not considered particularly concerning as an invasive species. One of the first truly local birds we met, though, was the iconic fantail. Fantails are well known for their very distinctive fantail, which does at least give you some warning that you're about to be accosted by one of these bolshy little birds. There appears to be no overt aggression in this. They are simply unconcerned by the presence of humans and will regularly approach visitors to their territory to within a metre or even less, as you can see here with my filming partner's boots. And provided the observer is quiet, they will generally continue to construct nests or even care for nestlings in the presence of humans. They also have an immediately recognisable cheep cheep call, which they often make while foraging for no immediately apparent reason. Another endemic New Zealand species with a very distinctive call is the bellbird. Captain Cook described these birds as having a call like small bells most exquisitely tuned, which leads me to conclude the man had never heard a bell before in his life. Bellbird calls are known to vary significantly from one region to another. However, the channel around Picton where we filmed these bellbirds is called the Cook Strait because this is where he landed, which makes it somewhat surprising that the presumed descendants of Captain Cook's bellbirds make a call not dissimilar to ripping Velcro. Unfortunately, unlike the fantail, the bellbird has struggled to adapt to human presence, and introduced predators such as cats, rats and stoats continue to keep population numbers low. Our next species was also observed by Captain Cook on all three of his visits to New Zealand, and his description of them was not that much more used than that of the bellbird, describing the two with great praise as, quote, "The flesh is most delicious and was the greatest luxury the woods afforded us," end quote. The tui is in fact the closest living relative of the New Zealand bellbird, and they share a number of behavioural habits and indeed coexist across much of their range, although physically they couldn't be much more distinct from one another. The most interesting similarity between the two species, at least from my perspective, is that although both species are primarily nectivorous, every individual we observed, if feeding at all, was doing so exclusively on honeydew. This honeydew is produced by the beech scale insect, and the incredibly sugar-rich substance is excreted from an anal tube that may be 10 times longer than the body of the scale insect itself. And certainly as you walk through the forests around Picton, you can often see thin, hair-like filaments sticking out from the trunks of trees, with little drops of honeydew on the end. With all of these colourful, energetic and occasionally obnoxiously loud birds so easily found among the branches and canopies of the trees around Picton, it would be easy to ignore the species that can be found at lower levels. Some, like these California quail, are introduced, although, thankfully, much like the blackbirds, they do not appear to be causing a significant ecological impact. Although they generally prefer not to, California quail will fly short distances, unlike many endemic New Zealand ground birds, such as the iconic kiwi, which we were not fortunate enough to see, or the weka, which we were. Much like the tui and the bellbird, Captain Cook encountered the weka when he visited New Zealand. Although Captain Cook is not recorded as having made any reference to their calls or edibility, it is perhaps of note that early European explorers and settlers frequently referred to the weka as bush hens. In areas where the weka is common, they can often be found around houses and are generally observed searching for food scraps or any items that are novel to them and easily transported. Much like corvids the world over, they have shown a marked preference for taking shiny objects in particular. The exact number of remaining weka in the wild is unknown. However, as a whole, the species is listed as vulnerable. While they adapt surprisingly well to disturbed habitats around human habitation, but have disappeared from huge areas of their former range that are otherwise undisturbed. This suggests that while these birds are highly adaptable, they are particularly vulnerable to predation. Being a coastal town, as soon as you leave the forests around Picton, it becomes quite hard not to find seabirds. Many of these species appear initially familiar, and indeed are generally related to similar species found around the world. Some, like this variable oystercatcher, would be almost impossible to distinguish from an African oystercatcher, were it not for the fact that one is found exclusively in southern Africa, the other exclusively in New Zealand. Other endemic New Zealand species, though, are very distinctive and easy to tell from a distance, such as the spotted shag shown here. Among their most notable features, hopefully quite obviously, is the double crest of feathers sticking up from their forehead and the nape of their neck. One of the more surprising spots, though, was not the species but the behaviour, as this pair of southern blackback gulls appear initially unremarkable until one of them stands up and reveals that it is missing a leg. For a species that has been observed, although not by us, pecking the eyes out of seal pups on the coast of Namibia, this appears surprisingly caring. Our next spot appeared to be a shark that had strayed into the waters of the harbour at Picton. And as fascinating as this would have been to observe, we were nevertheless very pleased to see that as it moved into clearer water, this was in fact a New Zealand fur seal. And while we had observed other species of fur seal previously, it was nevertheless quite a privilege to observe one of the few mammal species to make New Zealand their home. We observed several individuals in the harbour around Picton. They appear to be craning their heads under the surface, presumably looking for prey, but many of them would do so with one flipper raised above the water, as you see here. We later discovered that these seals were in fact jugging, a behaviour which they use to regulate their body temperature in the often cold waters around New Zealand. By keeping one flipper raised to catch as much sun as possible, they can keep their body temperature that little bit higher. Like the blackbird and the California quail, our penultimate species is also an introduced one. Unlike those two bird species, however, the common brush-tailed possum is one of the greatest threats to New Zealand's natural environment. They outcompete native species for nesting sites and food, and in the process of feeding on various plant species, completely destroy them, unlike many native species which consume only part of a plant, allowing the balance to either recover or be consumed by other species. Our final spot in New Zealand was one that I personally was absolutely thrilled with. One day, while hiking, in these small niches by the trail, we observed these unusual structures, which are, slightly disgustingly, nothing more or less than sticky mucus on strings. If you ever see these in person, this is a sign that you must return to this area at night. Should you choose to do so, you will discover that the area is quite literally crawling with glowworms, which produce an eerie blue-white glow, absolutely unlike the fireflies and other bioluminescent insects you may find elsewhere in the world.